now.
So, I'm probably in between you and lunch today, and in order to get your attention, let's play a game. The game's name is Are Anesthesiologists Frauds? But on a more serious note, what I really want to investigate is, are anesthetics really causing a loss of consciousness, or is it something else? So, round number one. Isolated form. So basically what is happening in this experiment is a glorified rubber band is being tied at the forearm of an anesthetized patient. In this case, the patient's rest of the body will be anesthetized as normal, but their forearm will not be paralyzed. And some patients, when the anesthesiologist tell them to respond, say, if you are still aware, please squeeze my hand, they will actually respond. To give you more specific data of, say, around 1,000 patients in 22 studies, around 34% of them had an actual response during induction or maintenance. So when they are supposedly unconscious, they can actually respond to verbal commands where they are not paralyzed. This is suggesting that maybe, as opposed to actually being unconscious, they are just being paralyzed, and the poor guy just cannot respond. Here, round number two is another isolated form study. In this case, there are 260 participants and 12 responded. And what's more interesting though is that among 5 of the 12 responders, they reported pain through a second hand squeeze. So don't do anesthetics, guys. They're bad. And also, for the people who record having an experience, none of them actually remember them after the whole anesthesia process. So this also indicates amnesia. So from the isolated forearm case, anesthetics are actually causing sensory motor disconnection or memory loss, rather than consciousness, at least in some cases. So that's -1 point for the anesthesiologist. Let's go on to round two. Now you may ask the question, even when the patient is not responding, even when they are not squeezing their forearm, what if they are still having conscious experience, but they just forgot later? So, during normal anesthesia, when we are not doing anything fancy, we just anesthetize them and let them wake up, some conscious experience would actually be recalled. So in one study, you had 300 patients, and they are interviewed right after anesthesia. 22% of them recalled having an experience. So it is possible that conscious experience will be recalled, but are more of them actually forgotten? So here's an experiment called Zero Awakening. It's quite simple. The spirit is just that you anesthetize some people, and then you wake them up in the middle. So if they are having an experience at that moment, they most likely will not forget it. So here's a specific experiment. Around 40-something participants are given anesthetics. At the first stage, the dose of the anesthetics was maintained at a constant level, supposedly loss of responsiveness, and then they were woken up 2 times. After that, the dose were increased, reaching the supposedly loss of consciousness, and then infusion was stopped, they are woken up for the 3rd time. So, what's the result? There are in total 93 interviews conducted, 48 during loss of responsiveness, 45 during a deeper stage, loss of consciousness. And 84% of the responses contain some experiences. So if you wake them up in the middle of anesthesia, 84% of them would recall consciousness. But if you do not wake them up in the middle, only 22% of the responses would recall consciousness. That might indicate quite a significant amnesia here. And even more interestingly, among all reports, 7 to 8 contain an experience that relates to the outside. So fortunately for us, most of them are dreamlike experiences. Most of them are not actually related to, say, the surgery or whatever.
Wait,
yes?
I only remember at the very end, you say 84% during serial awakening, but there are also
Sorry?
They had an interview, they were asked questions on what they remember at the very end.
Yes, yes.
How many of them remembered something at the very end versus when they were awoken at the beginning?
So at the end, this experiment actually did not ask the patients at the end about their previous awakenings. When they wake up at the end, they will only ask about their immediate past.
Okay.
So I cannot respond to that.
Is this already published or?
Yeah, this is already published. There's a citation list at the end of this presentation. So in this case, unresponsiveness is, not actually equal to unconsciousness. This possibility is often ignored due to quite severe amnesia. So, minus another point, the team anesthesiologists, they're not doing so well. Now, it's probably reasonable to make the case that when we are studying anesthesia, we should separate consciousness, sensory motor connection, and memory. But is this actually reflected in previous studies? So here, let's look at one of the pretty influential studies in anesthesia. It's called the Spectral Index. So basically, in this process, patients will wear a small EEG sticker on their forehead, and from the signals, some fancy algorithms would process it and convert it to a number from 0 to 100. Higher the number, higher the consciousness. And this number was supposed to help anesthesiologists to maintain unconsciousness during the surgery. Typical surgical target is 40 to 60. And now, this study tested, was this number actually helpful or was it not? So, there were two groups of patients. One of the groups, the first one was around 1,200 patients. They were applied this device that would give feedback to the anesthesiologist. And the confirmed awareness is around 2, which is 0.17%. And for the other group of the patients who were not paid, yes?
But that was awareness after surgery, they asked them what they remember.
Correct, that was only awareness after surgery, and that's what's questionable.
Okay.
So this, compared to the routine group, seems to be a pretty significant improvement. Much more people have confirmed awareness in the routine group, where they are not given this fancy device. So the conclusion of this study is that the bispectral index do help anesthesiologists to reduce the risk of awareness. What might be questionable though in this case is that they use explicit memory after surgery as an account for awareness. So, of course, this is ignoring the possibility of amnesia. In this case, what can be improved is perhaps to either conduct an isolated forearm technique to ensure there's no sensory motor connection, but they just forgot it later, or perhaps do serial awakening. But of course, this is actual surgery, so you cannot wake patients up. Again, -1 point. Second study, this one is investigating basically brain dynamics changes in the supposed loss of consciousness in anesthesia. So propofol was delivered to 19 healthy subjects, and then they were sedated to 4 stages: awake, mild sedation, deep sedation, which is supposedly unconsciousness, and then recovery. Each state was maintained for around 30 minutes and scans were conducted. They want to see how are the brain dynamics different. So, after some fancy algorithm, the details are not the main point here, they concluded that connectivity within and between the frontal-parietal control networks and the default mode network drops. Alright, would be nice if that's actually reliable, but what might be questionable here? So the Ramsay scale is actually solely dependent on behavior. So they were measuring unconsciousness solely on behavior. For example, when they say, okay, this patient is at Ramsay scale number 5, supposed unconsciousness, they are actually referring to sluggish response to loud auditory stimulus. So this is only directly tied to sensory motor disconnection rather than unconsciousness, which from previous cases are quite different, and they are separated by the isolated forearm technique. Therefore, these brain dynamic changes cannot be directly linked to unconsciousness, but rather they can only be directly linked to loss of responsiveness. So, due to the limitation of time, this will be the end of my game here. team anesthesiologists didn't do so well this time. I hope they do better next time. Maybe when I join the team, they will do better. But anyway, going forward, what might be useful here? So I think we need to have a more rigorous procedure in confirming unconsciousness during anesthesia. One possible modification is to have a standardized procedure, which may or may not contain isolated forearm to distinguish unconsciousness from sensory motor disconnection, or serial awakening to confirm actual loss of experience. And perhaps if these indexes are actually reliable, we can compute PCI or geometric phi alongside to help us confirm. Alright, that's the end of the game. Here are my citations.
Is there any comments? Madam?
I was just wondering if these studies include some sort of like confidence rating? Like when the patients report their experience, how sure are they that they saw something? Or I can imagine that the question itself is also already like, how do you say it? Suggestive, yeah.
So in those studies, I didn't see an explicit mention of confidence ratings, but they weren't only asking one question, are you conscious or not? Those questions are actually slightly more sophisticated. If you want to see how confident are you towards awareness, maybe you can look at those more specific responses to those list of questions that would help. But yes, I agree that having a confidence rating would help more.
About the group form, the number 3 and number 4, we start a bit of a collaboration, and in their case, they asked whether you are awake or not every 2 minutes or something like that. Also, they also present some kind of sound stimulus. So we could look at brain response to the sound before and after the CC and all
Any other? Yeah. We have a image also of their sleep, normal sleep. So is this consciousness putting the anesthetics, is it kind of sleep-like consciousness or?
So are you saying our anesthesia analogous to sleep? How similar are they? Is that your question?
Yeah, so it's like just well, I was just working on my alarm clock and my nice kid was in around one of the walls made a hole, and then I heard the alarm through the walls.
Okay, so drawing from a limited knowledge, there is a degree of similarity from anesthesia to sleep. In anesthesia, there's a popular hypothesis called the shared circuits hypothesis that basically said, okay, many areas of action of anesthetics are similar to those that are active in sleep. But when you do more causal experiments, say when you stimulate the VRPO, which is an area that's quite important for sleep, that actually doesn't make you more vulnerable to anesthetics. So yes, there are some kind of correlation, but the causal relationship hasn't really been established. Yes?
I don't remember any brain activity studies with the isolated forearm technique, the difference between people who are connected versus not. Do you know of any brain imaging studies with isolated forearm?
No, not that I know of. And I think it would be extremely helpful to incorporate that experiment in the future.
Yeah, because it's very realistic, right? This patient's gonna indoor arms.
Yeah, and it's a very real question. Like, is this loss of responsiveness or actual loss of consciousness? This simple technique, I think, will help a lot.
Is it technically feasible? Like during anesthesia to do the isolated forearm and then record the brain?
Takes time, but it's you need to organize. Like we have 1,000 patients tested, right, in the literature.
Yeah.
So the isolated forearm kind of device itself doesn't interfere or degrade the signal.
No, I mean, the paralysis is for that, and the rest is by something else.
I want to be a bit of the devil's advocate or sort of from IIT ontology. that one that we talked about, doesn't really matter. If if I take the, anesthesiologist kind of, defense side, right? Because if the people are all kind of forgetting in the end, and what matters is now of you who don't have any, memory of the bad experience or during the experience. So if you can make sure that, everybody actually forgets after the anesthesia, then you need to care about the, experience during the surgery.
So I can see where you're coming from that question. In response to that, firstly, shame on you, you are a fraud. The patients might actually be experiencing pain during the surgery, which is not what we want. But I guess from a more scientific point of view, say I want to validate IIT using anesthesia. I want to see whether the geometric five drops in anesthesia and rises in recovery. In this case, if my supposed unconscious state in anesthesia is actually unresponsiveness, that's not going to help me making my conclusion. So if you want to use anesthesia to validate certain theories of consciousness, or if you want to interpret their data, which is supposed unconsciousness, if these cases are actually just unresponsiveness or amnesia, this will significantly hinder scientific progress.
Yeah, the scientific progress and the model validation and testing validity theory, all of these things matters for this. But what I'm saying is that from your perspective, from you as a patient going to the surgery, and if everything is just made, make sure that I just forget about whatever happens during surgery, then it's a bit what the patient wants.
But I most likely won't be willing to experience a knife cutting through my body during the process though.
In America, I should say to the patient, look, you won't remember, you're gonna suffer, but you won't remember, that's not gonna lie.
I don't find it very reassuring.
You're not like a terrible thing, just forget about it.
So, this is, if you don't remember, that could be sort of registered as trauma.
That's a little debate, yeah.
I mean, this is actually is a little footnote in the book 5, okay, because the ontological question is quite relevant. But before I get back to that, the work of Jamie Slade in Auckland, New Zealand, who actually very much introduced the isolated core technique, is also associated with some neuroimaging, meaning EEG. So they did actually look at things like alpha theta ratio. There is some indication of what happens when you are comparing reports and no reports in Sweden in the isolated core technique. And there are some differences. It's just not done with high resolution EEG in a way that you can go perfectly. But that question, so the question whether typically in America you would ask the question, if I give you $1 million, I give you, a month of unbearable pain, but you won't remember it, will you do it? Okay? And that's one way to do it.
But $1 million,
You can make it large or small, etc. It's a good way to put a value in it. Okay? It is true that in my informal polling, as usual, most Americans say, I don't remember it. That's fine, which means Americans have a very slight regard for ontology.
that's his money,
Yeah, but it is an interesting question because if that is what existence is, the fact that you don't remember it absolutely doesn't matter at all in one sense. They only, of course, what they worry about is the patient suing because they remember something and then there is post-traumatic stress and all of that, so you have to pay them money for that. But the fact that you might have been there and suffered tremendously, even if you don't remember it, is ignored because it has no functional concept. So it very much ties back to this issue of functionalism versus ontology, versus being versus doing. It doesn't affect doing, it doesn't matter in the dominant paradigm. Instead, the paradigm that we are sort of pushing for is what matters is being, and to a large extent that's reflected in doing. But that's a perfect association between being and doing. Being total pain, doing no concept.
Now, to go back to the practical clinical realm, typically what happens, like the biggest side effect you can have from anesthesia is like if you get higher doses of anesthetics. And a lot of the time, anesthesiologists, the ones I talk to, they actually optimize on cardiovascular, function rather than even like EEG is not very reliable. So you can make a point that you actually really want to target, when it's not to target, get particular to these, like being disconnection or consciousness rather than not knowing at all. And so that you can decrease, keep anesthesia to a minimum.
Yeah, one more thing to add there is that at least some recognition is beginning to happen that you can titrate anesthetics and different anesthetics, but they're not all the same and there are cocktails, to reduce arousal, that's sedation, reduce responsiveness and executive function, that's probably when they start acting on prefrontal cortex, to reduce experience, and in the middle of that, the amnestic dose, which is a lower dose, to reduce memory. So you have to consider all of these, and you have to consider all the right kind of brain areas to do a proper evaluation of what anesthetic does. The other thing to say, which you didn't mention, but it's important, is that unlike sleep, it's one problem, but it's almost impossible to come out of anesthesia instantly. And therefore there is a really big problem of knowing the confabulation part, whether indeed the experience was had during the anesthesia or in the time you are coming out, okay, which is typically sort of a long and fluctuating time. One more technical thing
Which is why the isolated forearm is useful.
yeah.
During
No doubt, that's doing and it tells you something,
Yeah.
absolutely. But when you do retrospectively, with anesthetic, it can't just be immediate. With sleep, it can be close to immediate in some cases. With anesthesia, it can. And then,
Except Benedetta has those in the propofol where you can wake up people from there getting eating before. But in a typical surgical case, you won't get it.
yes, you have it in the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave that.
Yeah.
It's a good lunch.
Okay, shall we lunch? Thank you.